southwestern Oklahoma, 1848. In the middle of the night, deep in the Wichita Mountains, a small village of Comanche lies quiet, with almost all of its inhabitants deep in slumber. Inside of a warm teepee, a young mother and her infant son are sleeping peacefully. The woman's name is now.By, and she is the wife of a revered war chief named Nakona. The baby boy is the couple's first child together and the apple of his parents' eye. His name is Quanah. For weeks now, since the day of his birth, Nakona has fawned over his newborn son. He has bragged and boasted to his comrades about the size and strength of his boy and of the great deeds he would surely accomplish as a hunter and warrior. But on this night, Nakona is miles away. He and the rest of the able-bodied warriors in the village are on the warpath. The Comanche are a mighty people who have laid claim to the most valuable real estate on the plains for roughly a century and a half by now. By this point in the late 1840s, they have subjugated or driven off virtually anyone who has opposed them, from the Tonkawa to the Spanish to, most recently, the Texans. In doing so, they have acquired an extensive list of enemies, from the aforementioned adversaries in the Spanish, Texans, and Tonkawas, to itinerant Mexican farmers and American fur traders. The Comanche had not hesitated to inflict horrific damages in order to sustain their territories in the southern plains. The afternoon prior to this evening, Nakona had assembled his band of raiders, and the party had headed west. This group is largely composed of warriors from the Nokoni, or Wanderers Band, and likely includes a few members from other bands, as well as their longtime allies, the Kiowa. Their intention is to engage a Navajo war party that has been spotted in the area. Their conflict with the Navajo is one of their oldest, longest-running feuds, and the Comanche warriors bristle at the thought that their territory is being encroached upon. The warring between tribes, though often unrecorded, was often fraught with atrocities and horrific losses. The fight for resources and territory was as constant as the battle against the elements and starvation. A vicious, seemingly unbreakable cycle of grievance and vengeance often held rival tribes at odds for decades. Raiding was seen as a cultural pastime, perhaps even a cultural necessity, by most tribes on the continent. It was viewed as a perfectly honorable pursuit to find the nearest village of a longtime enemy and sweep down upon them in a torrent of violence. The killing of males was generally to be expected, but women and children were often not exempt from such horrific, violent ends. Those not killed immediately could expect, at best, to be adopted into the tribe that had just decimated their families. The worst they could expect was a torturous end that would later be spoken of in feared, hushed tones around the campfires of pioneers, Texas Rangers, and Army soldiers. Those raids might come at any time, though generally they slowed during the winter. Should a village be caught unprepared, it could find itself snuffed out by an enemy raiding force, gone as though it never existed. To be sure, this is not to say that intertribal warfare was the only interaction between tribes, as many tribes had long established relationships with their neighbors based on trade and mutual welfare. However, life for all tribes was a continual fight against privation and scarcity, one that created a quite fluid map of tribal territories and loyalties. Tribes like the Crow were driven out by the Sioux, while the Apache were driven from virtually the entirety of Texas by the Comanche. The Navajo, who referred to themselves as Dine, or the people, had long warred with their Apache and Ute neighbors, but even in 1848 still held a particular disdain for the Comanche. The Navajo had descended from the Athabascan-speaking tribes of northwestern Alaska and Canada. Their ancestors, along with the ancestors of the Apache, had come down to what are the present-day states of Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico from their area of shared origin sometime in the late 1400s. They had at first existed as hunter-gatherers, but had adapted the crops and farming techniques of the Pueblo people, who had inhabited the area for centuries. Though their relationship with the Pueblo would also be fraught with contention throughout the years, the Navajo adapted quickly to their new environs by focusing on the production of the three sisters crops of corn, beans, and squash. With the arrival of the Spanish, Goats and sheep became common in the American Southwest as they were a hardy protein source that could subsist on the meager grazing options available in the sparse deserts. As the Spanish continued their northward incursion from Mexico in the 16 and 1700s, they too were subject to the same relationship of intermittent trading and raiding, as were all neighbors of the proud and powerful Diné people. Meanwhile, in Texas, the Comanche had risen to power after migrating from the northern Rockies as a part of a Shoshone offshoot. Though they had initially been a people decidedly averse to conflict and conquest, this had all changed after meeting the North American continent's most valuable imported animal, the horse. They had ascended to prominence in a matter of decades, and gone from perpetually impoverished to ruthlessly enterprising. In the 1700s, the Comanche had realized the great profits that tribes like the Utes were making in trading slaves to the Spanish as well as other tribes. They had, in fact, united with the Utes for a time and wrought havoc upon the Navajo, the Jicarilla Apache, and the Lipan Apache. These brutal slave raids were carried out with the same ruthless efficiency as were raids for slaves in Africa and South America. Countless times for decades on end, terrified and traumatized people, mostly women and children, would be bargained and bartered for in remote locales on the New Mexico frontier. The Comanche had, in fact, been so feared by the Navajo that the master Spanish diplomat, Juan Bautista de Anza, had used them as an intimidation tactic while bargaining with the Navajo. In early 1786, the Spaniard had managed to, miraculously, come to a peace agreement with the Comanche. Terms were agreed upon that were acceptable to both parties, and a time of peaceable coexistence with the Comanche, a once unthinkable feat but a few years before, began. Only a few weeks after this agreement, de Anza had prudently used his newly minted allies to surprise the Navajo chiefs who had come to visit him to discuss preliminary terms for a potential peace agreement of their own. When de Anza informed the visiting Navajos that the Comanche were now his personal friends, the message to the Navajo was implicit. Should they not agree to halt their own raiding of de Anza's outpost, they could expect a visit from their much-dreaded enemy. Peace terms were subsequently agreed upon, and for a time, a period of socio-political stasis on the southern plains was, at least to some degree, achieved. The Comanche also referred to themselves as the people, in their language, Namernu. They viewed themselves through a lens of unabashed superiority, and their enemies as something less than, worthy of neither pity nor mercy should they intrude upon Comanche land or offend Comanche sensibilities. However, their bloodline is one of the most diverse on record amongst native peoples on the North American continent. This is due to the Comanche penchant for adopting a portion of the captives that they stole. Many times over the preceding centuries, at remote locations on the Texas frontier, families of Tonkawa, Karankawa, Lipan Apache, Mexican settlers and Texas farmers had been decimated, with their women and children often carried away, never to see their homeland or kinfolk again. Those not sold as slaves to other tribes or New Mexico traders would often end up as fully fledged members of the Comanche. This could be a relatively seamless process with young children who would simply be raised as Comanche. However, oftentimes the process for adoption into the tribe was a harrowing, lengthy, and arduous process. For their first weeks or even months with the tribe, the newly acquired captives would be made to do the least desirable jobs in camp, from cleaning buffalo hides to tending horse herds. This had been the fate of now.By, the young mother who now lies with her infant, deeply ensconced in this Comanche stronghold in the Wichita Mountains. She had been born in Crawford County, Illinois, in either 1824 or 1825, to Silas and Lucinda Parker. Her birth name had been Cynthia Ann Parker. In 1833, when she was 8 or 9 years old, her grandfather, former Continental Army soldier John Parker, convinced her parents, as well as several other members of the Parker family, to immigrate to Texas. At the time, Texas was in a state of upheaval, awash in chaos and bloodshed. It was 3 years before Texas would win its independence from Mexico and establish itself as an independent republic. However, the cause of the bloodshed was not the warring of principalities, but the incessant raiding of the Comanche. The Parkers were well aware of the raiding, and had constructed a fort to protect themselves against the Comanche attacks. But, on the morning of May 19, 1836, when the men were out working in the fields and the gate to the fort was wide open, the Comanche had made their attack. By this time, the Texas War for Independence from Mexico was raging, with the Battle of the Alamo having occurred only a few months earlier. With their two main contenders for Texas engaged in fighting each other, the Comanche were wreaking unfettered havoc on homesteads all across the Texas frontier. What had started out that morning at the fort as a painfully awkward exchange marked by overtures of peace by the Parkers quickly devolved into a massacre in which most of the men in the family were killed and the women and children taken prisoner. Samuel Frost, Robert Frost, Silas Parker, and Benjamin Parker were all cut down and scalped. The 77-year-old John Parker was, in what order we will never know, scalped, emasculated, and killed. The young Cynthia Ann had been taken, along with Elizabeth Kellogg, age 39, John Richard Parker, age 5, Rachel Parker Plummer, age 17, and her baby son James Pratt Plummer, age 1 year, 4 months. James Pratt Plummer would soon be killed by the Comanche due to his inability to keep quiet as they traveled. The unfortunate toddler was summarily disposed of by Comanche warriors roping him and dragging him behind their galloping horses. The rest of the Parker clan would, eventually, be returned to their family, though all would be permanently affected. Cynthia Ann, however, had been taken in by a kindly Comanche woman who cared for her and shielded her from the sights and sounds of the physical, psychological, and sexual traumatization being inflicted upon her aunts at the hands of the Comanche captors. She had been subjected to cruel treatments initially as well, but over time had gradually become accepted by and then adopted into the tribe. Life as a Comanche woman, though, was a seemingly endless succession of chores seen as below the stature of men whose primary roles were as hunters and warriors. While the worst jobs could be outsourced to slaves held by a woman's husband, a Comanche man often also kept multiple wives, as they were seen as little more than homekeepers and childbearers. However, by all available accounts, and by her own later recollections, Cynthia Ann loved her husband, and was very proud of his stature as a warrior and chief. She also loved her newborn boy, whose veins coursed with the blood of both Comanche chieftain and colonial soldier. Now, in her new life as now.By, she felt protected as part of a great nation of warriors who would defend her and her children with their lives. However, on this night, both mother and child are in grave danger. Lurking in the post oaks surrounding their village are a band of Navajo raiders who have been stalking the village for days. They are the party that had been spotted by the Comanche sentries the day before. They have counted on Peta Nakona and his warriors to charge out of the village to find them and have remained hidden in the hills with the intent of attacking the village once the majority of the warriors had left. In their blind fury, the Comanche have fallen for the ruse, and Peta Nakona and company are miles away. However, the camp is, of course, not left unguarded. But what remains are largely teenage boys, elderly men, and warriors who are injured or otherwise unable to accompany the raiding party. The Navajo raiding party now advances upon the village, riding slowly and deliberately atop their unshod ponies. They are cloaked in darkness and intent on killing any Comanche they can find, and making off with as many of the Comanche's valuable horses as possible. As they advance, they find themselves so close to the village that they can make out the silhouettes of those still awake in their lodges. It is then, however, that the barking of the village dogs alerts the Comanche sentries on guard. These are young teens given the task of standing guard as a precursor to service as a full-fledged warrior. But they are ready and willing to do all that is necessary in defending their homes, families, and possessions. Within seconds, the loud wolf-like howls of the Comanche flood the air, awakening all within the village and sending the remaining able-bodied men flooding out of their lodges. The 16 Navajo are met with a hail of arrows and quickly reconsider their main attack on the village. Instead, the comparatively horse-poor Navajo turn their sights towards the sizable Comanche herd. As a few of the Navajo whirl about the outskirts of the village in order to distract the Comanche, the remainder are able to get away with nearly 200 of the Comanche's horses. Then, almost as quickly as they have appeared, the Navajo are gone, heading southwest at full speed. For the remainder of the night, the Comanche are left to seethe, as riders are sent out to inform Peta party of what has occurred. now.Da, meanwhile, has been yet again thoroughly traumatized by a raiding force of natives. Now, as she clasps her newborn tightly and waits on the return of her husband and his cohorts, one can only imagine the mix of terror and righteous indignation swirling in her heart and mind. The life she had so tediously built after the sudden and violent collapse of all she had known as a child had nearly been snuffed out at the blunt end of Navajo war clubs. In a few hours, Peta and his warriors ride back into the village. After checking on their wives and children, the enraged party heads out on the trail of the Navajo. The fleeing Navajo know they have acquired a sizable bounty in the way of their newly seized horse herd, but the additional 200 animals also present a consequential challenge in slowing the party down drastically. The Navajo have no intention of engaging a full war party in open territory during the daylight hours, and know that their only chance in returning safely with the bounty of their raid is to beat the Comanche back to the safety of Navajo territory. They are, however, no match for the Comanche war party, who are now riding hard over ground they had known since childhood. The Navajo raiders are caught within hours, and 3 are cut down in a storm of Comanche arrows, lances, and tomahawks. The remaining 13 Navajo scatter into the west, leaving their dead comrades and stolen horses to the Comanche. Peta and his warriors are now in a jovial mood. No Comanche has lost their life at the hands of the intruders, and they have managed to wreak just retribution on their enemies, all while reacquiring their stolen horses. Amidst great glee and whoops of joy and excitement, the Navajo warriors who have been killed are now cut to pieces. As is customary after a victory amongst almost all Plains tribes, the vanquished are marred and eviscerated in hopes that the wounds will be carried into the next life as a reminder of the cost of their misdeeds. Hours later, as the sun begins to fade into the Oklahoma skyline, Peta leads his warriors back into the Comanche village. He greets his wife now.Da and holds up a long Comanche lance, to the top of which are affixed the 3 freshly taken Navajo scalps. With great joy and relief, the Comanche hold a victory dance. For 4 days, drums are beaten, songs are sung, and fires kept burning. One of the first things that the young son of Peta and now.Da sees in his initial few weeks in this world is the sight of his father and the other warriors dancing around a large campfire in the middle of the Wichita Mountains, holding high the freshly dismembered scalps of their hated enemies. To the Comanche, it now seems they are untouchable here on the southern plains. They have driven off these intruders just as they had driven off all the others who had seen fit to challenge them for dominion over these invaluable lands. It must have seemed to Peta that his son, the young Quanah, was destined for a princely life that would see him ascend to a position even more powerful than his father, and to now.Da it must have seemed as though her former life as Cynthia Ann was a world away, something she could forget forever, as she was now part of, and party to, the lineage of the proud Comanche. But the young parents, as it would turn out, are only partially correct. In just over a decade, the world they now know will be overturned entirely. In little more than a year, the Comanche will begin to see a curious outbreak amongst their people. It starts amongst the Penteca, the southernmost and largest band of the Comanche, who live in closest proximity to the white settlements. Then, it begins to spread. The afflicted suffer from severe diarrhea and vomiting, dying of kidney failure and dehydration often within hours of being infected. The disease is known as cholera, and it will go on to kill an estimated half of the Penteca band by the 1860s. The epidemic will go on to devastate not only the Comanche, but virtually every tribe it comes into contact with. Coming on the heels of several devastating smallpox epidemics throughout the early 19th century, the demographic collapse of the lords of the Southern Plains was all but assured. The Comanche would also be continually pressured by the incessant influx of settlers into the burgeoning Republic of Texas. In the coming decades, they would see their territory encroached upon and taken over until they were relegated to but a small corner of their beloved homelands. now.Da would see her life upended yet again, as Texas Rangers would kill her husband and haul her and her baby off in 1860 to be returned to the Parker family. During this raid, Quanah and his little brother, a boy known as Peanuts, would escape the fighting, never to see their mother again. Quanah, for his part, would go on to become the last great chief of the Comanche, a fierce warrior and skilled diplomat, and a man who seemed perpetually caught between two worlds. But in 1848, all of this seems inconceivable to the joyous band of Comanche as they sing and chant into the night, faces alit by the flames. They are the mighty lords of the southern plains, the Nirmanu, the people, and their downfall is not yet at hand. And so for now, the many tales of the Comanche's reign over the southern plains, as well as the lives and legacies of the Navajo, Texans, Mexicans, and Americans, are all other stories for other times. Thank you for tuning into this episode of History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to click like, share, subscribe, and if you'd like to support our work, click the link in the description below to become a subscriber on Patreon. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.